Welcome back to the Adaptive Athlete Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Hotho. On today's episode, we're talking with Abbey Phillipson. Abbey is the head strength and conditioning coach of Paralympic and adaptive sports at the University of Michigan. Abbey is also an adaptive athlete herself, having Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. I can't wait to hear about her story, both as an adaptive athlete and as an elite strength and conditioning coach for adaptive athletes. So, Abbey, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. I'm glad that Alina introduced us. Alina was on episode 2 of the podcast. Now we're much deeper in on the podcast, but I'm glad she made this connection. So, Abbey, tell me a little bit about what makes you an adaptive athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born with classical Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which is a genetic connective tissue disorder. And so basically the things that come with that have led me to being in the adaptive athlete space. So my skin is super, super elastic and prone to like huge lacerations that usually need pretty significant medical attention. I had a stage 5 spondylolisthesis in my L4, L5, S1, which led me to being a wheelchair user for a bit of time. And then also I have extreme joint hypermobility, which leads to frequent joint dislocations and joint pain. So it really depends on the day whether I consider myself someone with an able body or somebody who's living with a disability. And so that gives me, I would like to think a unique lens on accessibility in the world as a whole, but especially in the athletic space.
Yeah, I feel like there's those disabilities that are sort of invisible in some ways, right? Like someone looking at you or even looking at me wouldn't go, oh, this person is disabled necessarily. And yet, right, we live in that space. Although with your hypermobility, I'm sure you have a great overhead squat.
I have a great overhead squat and a lot of party tricks.
Right. And I'm like, I would take half of your mobility. Just give it here. These spastic muscles would love some of that overhead squat mobility.
We can find a way to meet in the middle someday.
Yes, that'd be great. Let's talk about your journey though with EDS. So you ended up having to be a wheelchair user for a certain number of years when you were in high school, but then you came out of that and discovered something really cool about fitness and training. Can you tell me that journey a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a gymnast and dancer, and I add the word wannabe sometimes because you can only be so good at it until your hypermobility and everything that comes with gymnastics being such a sport prone to injury. You can only use your hypermobility to be good at it for so long. So I consider myself a wannabe gymnast dancer because that had an expiration date from the beginning. But coming out of dance and gymnastics as my condition progressed, I had about a year of experiencing the start of nerves dying in the back of my left leg, excruciating pain. My torso started to be really bent in a weird shape, and I just really couldn't move anymore. It was like I was moving in 2 separate halves of my body. Okay. And so I put off the surgery for a long time because I kind of just wanted to keep doing what I was doing. Being 16 years old, needing an anterior and posterior surgical entrance scared me, especially with how bad I scar with my condition. So I put it off for longer than I should have, and ended up having a stage 5, which is near irreversible spondylolisthesis, led to a bunch of fractures in the L4, L5, S1. I had a wonderful neurosurgeon named Dr. Tekman Su here in Southeast Michigan, who wanted to do a case study on the comorbidity of Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome and spondylolisthesis. Deep dove into Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which I think led to having a positive surgical outcome given how bad my condition was at the time. And so coming out of the operating room, starting to recover, he was fervent in the fact that he wanted me to start not physical therapy, not occupational therapy. He wanted me to start strength training. With Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, the muscle fibers themselves are largely unaffected by the connective tissue disorder, though the things that the muscles are connecting to are very much affected. And so he wanted me to take bite-sized amounts of ranges of motion and put a heavy enough load on those ranges of motion to actually produce an adaptation of thicker, stronger, sizable, more durable muscle fibers to connecting to the joint to stabilize the joint. So that was his goal for me. And he promised me that even though the first few months are going to make it worse before it makes better, he promised a dose of consistency and just not giving up the muscle growing process was going to yield less dislocations, less injuries long term. So I did it, and I liked what it was doing for me. I kind of got addicted to it. My best friend since I was 1 year old is Alexis Raptis, who competes in the CrossFit Games all the time. How lucky it is to be able to say that.
Perennially. She's there
Yeah,
every year. Yeah.
every year, and always does well. But it was her who really supported this journey
Mm,
for me.
wow.
Um, and just seeing like this is somebody that I've looked up to since I was little and wanted to be just like she did gymnastics with me and she was way better because her body worked. But it was somebody that I always admired her strength and her
Yeah.
consistency and wanted so badly to keep up with her. And so it was leaning on people like her. My family is very active as well to just see what I could be if I stuck to it. Um, so it was about 6 months after my strength training journey started that I went and traveled to see Alexis when she was training in Utah. And I trained in a CrossFit gym for the first
Mm,
time, and I loved it. And that whole weekend, my body was feeling more equipped than ever to hike through the mountains with Alexis, go to the
hmm.
waterfalls on the top of a cliff. And just, I felt so capable and I felt so, I had a bit of able body fight in me. I was like, well, this is weird. Like the more I do, the more I get to do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that was the start of it for me.
I love that because I think frequently about, the PT that I went to as a kid, right, with CP, and thinking like, man, if only someone had just said, why don't you try some strength training? They were so afraid to load us with weight because they want to make sure we have balance or flexibility or that kind of thing, that really we never got the strength. And then our
Yeah.
muscles would just atrophy. That's one thing that happens with CP on the affected side or hemisphere. And now that when I discovered CrossFit, what was so interesting is the building of muscle made everything feel better,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Just like you said it was hypertrophy. How do you say that? Hypertrophy?
Hypertrophy is usually what people say. Yeah.
Hypertrophy. How that hypertrophy training helps you kind of get that control back in your joints and to feel stronger and that kind of thing. Do you
Yeah, absolutely.
so that was your doctor kind of pushing that, and then the friendship with Alexis that really kind of helped that kind of take off for you?
Yeah, I think what obviously, and we take this approach with the adaptive athletes I work with, which we'll touch on in a bit, um, is at first there was a medical necessity, but that medical necessity can only go so far if the
Yeah.
individual themselves doesn't want it so badly for themselves too, and also see it as a solution, right? Because how many times have you been to the doctor and they say, "Well, try this," and you're like, "Oh my God, that's not going to work." But I wanted so badly for it to, and I did have belief that it would, because of the support systems around me of people who are doing amazing things with their body. And so not only was it a medical necessity first, but then it was me who wanted to
Hmm.
perform well, wanted my body to do things for me. So I was like, you know what? Screw it. Let's try it.
Yeah.
Nothing can hurt me at this point. I mean, my spine is fused all together.
Right.
So
Right, right. So you went from a wheelchair at 17, a walker, to doing this training, and then you did bodybuilding, and that went pretty
yeah.
well, huh?
Yeah, so in my undergraduate at the University of Michigan, obviously I just stayed consistent, even though my body was doing well. I knew it was something that if I was going to start strength training and it was going to help me, it was a forever thing. There's no way that I can stop doing it at one point. And so obviously the consistency kept up. A bit of paranoia of reversing my progress
Yeah,
kept me
losing the
very
gains or anything like
consistent.
that. Yeah.
Yes, knowing what it feels like to live in a body that doesn't work in the way you want it to, and then having it work, was like paranoia,
Yeah.
which was hard mentally, but it kept me very consistent. And it got me to the point where I had some muscle mass on me for being 21, 22 years old at the time. And so I wanted to be potentially, I don't know if there's no way of proving this, but I wanted to be the first person with Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome to win a bodybuilding show.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know of anybody who had Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome who had competed at that level. And so I decided, you know what, I've done so many hard things. This is just going to be one of those things. Like a lot of times as a disabled athlete, you think, I can't worry about my aesthetic. I can't worry about my physique because I have to just take care of my body. I was like, you know what? I can't have that. I'm not going to leave that on the list of things that are only for able-bodied folks. Like I'm going to look cool. And so
Yeah.
I competed in bodybuilding. Um, placed pretty well. I got first place in novice at both of my competitions. Decided it wasn't for me. I want to
Okay.
compete to feel good and be the strongest version of myself, not look like I'm
Yeah.
strong. I felt so weak during that time. So I won't
Yeah.
be going back to bodybuilding, but it was a quick, diversion from the path.
So,
And now I'm back on track
and you became the first place bodybuilder with EDS that you know of.
that I know of.
Mission accomplished. There you go. But so then the next part of your journey that I think is the coolest part of your journey that I can't wait to dive into is what you do at the University of Michigan. So tell me all about the program at the University of Michigan, the Paralympic Training Center that's there, the people you get to work with. I mean, just let's start with the center itself, what they've created there, what it offers for student athletes. Let's start there.
Sure, yeah. So I graduated from the University of Michigan. During my time there, with a previous love for doing gymnastics myself, and then seeing, having a disability that kept me from doing that sport, I started a organization at the University of Michigan called Adaptive Gymnastics in 2018. And from there, we offered gymnastics, and a lot of which was just strength training, balance, proprioception, things like that, to folks living with disabilities in the community. We served over, I think it ended up being 180 families when I left. Program's still going strong, but that was University of Michigan, and that's what got me introduced to adaptive sport. And then after I graduated, I stuck around in Ann Arbor, was working as an administrator for a gym franchise, and saw my boss actually brought to me a job posting from the University of Michigan that they were looking for a Paralympic strength and conditioning coach.
Mm,
And I was like, there is no way that this is a real job that I could have, considering it was my dream job that I didn't even know was my dream job. Didn't
yeah.
even know it was possible without creating the job for myself. Not only was it at the school that I went to and fell in love with, but it's also everything that I was. I have a nutrition certification, personal training, and then I also have my CSCS, certified strength and conditioning specialist. And so all of these things, and I'm looking at the list of things that were required for it and what they were looking for in the mission. I saw them on social media, visited their website, got connected with them, and I was like, this is my dream job. I have to have it. I
Yeah.
absolutely just have to have this job. And so there was a qualification that I did not have that was on their list. And I told them I do not have this requirement. It's the requirement to be a collegiate coach. Told them I didn't have the requirement, and I kept making it to the next interview round. I was like, why are they keeping me? Like, I'm not qualified. I don't have the qualification. So it was at my final in-person interview, which was doing a strength and conditioning session for 4 different athletes, all with completely different classifications. There were 2 wheelchair users, 2 folks that were ambulatory, spinal cord injury, there was a muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, and POTS. So I
Okay.
had to make a workout that they could all do. That was my final interview, and it was in front of the board. So I did that without having the qualification I needed. And they talked to me at the end of the interview, and they said, you need to take that exam and you need to pass it, and then we'll talk.
And then we'll hire you.
So
Yeah. Wow.
I quit my current job to study for the exam that I need to get the qualification for. Most folks study for a really long time, but that's probably a couple hours a day. I locked in. It was like
Hmm.
14 hours a day studying time. I passed, and the next day they offered me the job. So I am now the Paralympic strength and conditioning coach at the University of Michigan. And so we're currently intercollegiate, meaning that both student athletes and athletes within the Ann Arbor community can be on our team so that we can have a full roster.
Okay.
So as we're building the program, which has only been around since 2019, we have we're a little over half with student athletes. So student athletes who are students at the University of Michigan can compete on one of our 5 teams, which is wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby, adaptive track and field, wheelchair tennis, and para powerlifting, which
Mm.
I'm also the coach of para powerlifting, which has been so fun. So you can compete on one of those 5 teams. A lot of athletes with the prospect of going to the Paralympics. So
Hmm.
I think a lot of people hear parasport or adaptive sports and they think like, like they have, a club for disabled athletes to play basketball. It's like, oh no, like
Yeah.
these folks are going to the Paralympics. Like we'll see you in LA 2028.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a really, really cool space to be in because it is elite athletics. We are using the same training facilities as University of Michigan Division I varsity athletics. So when we're in the strength and conditioning space, you might look to the rack to the right of you, and you've got D1 gymnast from University of Michigan.
Yeah.
You look to the other side and you've got a basketball player, a lacrosse player. And so we are in these spaces claiming space as athletes with disabilities, saying we're not just para athletes, we are athletes, and we are high caliber, high performance
Yeah.
athletes.
Yeah.
So
That's
that
so
is the
cool.
work that we're doing.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's amazing for them to get to claim that for themselves as athletes, right? By the way they're treated, by the facilities they're given, by who they're put in the room with, to tell them all these things about who they are. Whereas so many times, by the way society treats them, they're told everything they're not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're in this space where now they're getting told all these things that they are and that they're capable of. And I can just imagine what it does for their performance. So
Sure, absolutely.
you work with two Paralympians that you've sent me articles about. Anyways, can you tell me about Chuck and about Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a few of them. I sent you only those because those have been quite, in the spotlight as
Yeah.
just because of their performance. Like they're incredible. I'll start with Chuck Aoki. Chuck Aoki, at the time that I sent you the article about Chuck Aoki was a member of our wheelchair rugby team who is been to the Paralympics multiple times, has 3 silver medals from the Paralympics. And he is the team captain of Team USA wheelchair rugby. So he plays with the University of Michigan wheelchair rugby team on our team. He now, as of a couple weeks ago, is now our wheelchair rugby coach. So we had a coaching position open for that position, and so he went from player to player and coach now.
Oh,
So I can't
fun.
leave that
Okay.
part out. So he's my
Nice.
coworker now. But Chuck Aoki, I've been training with him since I started the position. So I write programs for all of our athletes, Chuck included. So as he trains with Team USA for what, his 7th time, something like that.
Yeah, I was trying to
Um,
do the math on that. Like he's been to a
yeah,
lot of
he has been to
Olympics.
a lot of Paralympic Games. What we
Yeah.
like to say is he is like the LeBron James of wheelchair rugby.
Okay.
He's a big deal. He's been on, if you go on a Delta flight, he's like in their slides
Oh my
that you have
gosh.
on the back. Yeah,
Okay.
big deal. He's in the Samsung commercials and like all the big things. Um, but yeah, so I write his strength program for him to peak for, not for training camps, but for like worlds, for selection camp, for obviously the Paralympics,
Okay.
para trials, things like that. So yeah, that's Chuck. We also have Leo Merle and Sam Grew, who are both adaptive track athletes with us. We're students
Mhm.
at the university. And both of them went to the Paralympics in Paris this past year. That was Leo's first Paralympics. That was Sam's third
Oh
Paralympics.
wow.
Third or fourth. And he was a gold medalist in, I want to say Tokyo. So yeah, Sam was
Wow.
defending his gold medal. Um, yeah, so I wrote their strength programs as well.
So when you say you
Um,
write their strength programs, just out of
mhm.
curiosity, like so Sam, I think I saw in the article, he's missing a leg, right? Or I'm sorry if I'm
Yep,
not saying that
yep.
correctly. Is it above knee or below knee?
He is an above the knee single amputee.
Okay, yeah. So when you write his strength conditioning program, you're working on giving him all the strength and conditioning he needs to do the high jump, but to do that with only one leg.
Yep, yep. So we have about 70 athletes. And so every single one of our athletes has a different disability in a different sport. And within, even if they had the same disability and are competing in the same sport, they have very, very different needs. And that is unique. So if you go into the Strength and Conditioning Center at Michigan and you're, you know, the adaptive sports team and track and field are in there, or lacrosse or basketball, all of those athletes are doing the same program because they have generally the same body mechanics. They're
Yeah,
competing in the same
yeah,
sport, have the same needs. I don't have a single athlete on the same program as another athlete.
yeah,
And so it gets crazy in the weight room. But to your point, um, I can't just, Sam or I can't just Google, what's a good strength and conditioning exercises for a above the knee amputee high jumper.
yeah.
You don't get anything. And I think in the future, I would love to have an adaptive training guide. And it really is at your fingertips of, hey, what's a good exercise as a high jumper with one leg? Like that would be
Hmm.
awesome if Meta could populate something like that, but we're not there yet. And so that's where a lot of creativity comes with adapting exercises for across the board, 5 sports, ton of different disabilities, and 70 different people.
Do you have any resources that you use for that that you could recommend to people who are maybe coaching adaptive athletes or trying to come up with programming for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually currently writing an intro to strength for an adaptive athlete and just kind of how to reframe how you think of exercises when entering an adaptive space. So I don't have that yet, obviously,
Yeah.
but it's in the works.
Okay.
But there's a textbook, Essentials of Strength and Conditioning, that if you have your CSCS, you've read this book front to back probably multiple times. But reminding yourself that when learning about the principles that drive science of strength and conditioning, that drive exercise science, that is not exclusive to an able-bodied individual. And so I think to your point earlier, falling in the trap as an adaptive athlete of, like I got to do lightweight high rep or
Hmm.
like, I have a spinal cord injury. And so my triceps are spotty. So I can't do something like bench. And so taking this approach of walking into a gym space and thinking of all the things that you cannot do, the equipment that you can't do, the type of exercises you can't do, that's like a bottom up approach. Bottom up approach will work for an able bodied athlete, doesn't work for an athlete living with a disability. So entering a strength and conditioning space, taking a top down approach of this person, the laws of strength and conditioning, the laws of exercise science still apply to this individual. Um, so taking a look at the equipment and uh, exercises and muscles that they have working really, really well for them. And then instead of eliminating, but thinking, okay, this person, their chest is pretty strong, their shoulders move pretty well. What's an exercise that involves chest and shoulder? The bench press. The bench press involves the chest and shoulder. All right. How can we make the bench press work for someone with a spinal cord injury? If they're on a bench, maybe their core isn't enough to keep them on a standard skinny bench. Do we have access to a wider bench? Could I put them on the floor to
Yeah.
mitigate how their core shifts on the bench while they're trying to bench press? And so take an exercise that you would give to an able-bodied athlete and think, how do I make this work? Period. End of story. There's going to be a way. I have athletes with incomplete paraplegia that are doing leg days.
Oh,
Their
wow.
knees cave in, they have valgus. So what do? I take the squat and I put a hard cube block in between their knees so that their knees cannot cave in. They can't neurally connect to kind of start the movement to be able to squat down. So I take a foam roller and I put it at their back, and the gravity rolls them down the wall. And then they can use their little bit of neural connection they have to come back up. So take the exercises that you would give to anybody and just get creative for a moment. It's not going to
Yeah.
look like it always does, but it can if you just give it some time, some creativity.
Yeah, I think I'd love to have you back on at some point to talk about some of this book that you're working on and some of these ideas about how to do these activities. I think having a CrossFit coach on here to talk to you about that would be really
Oh,
interesting.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
that would
to
be
kind of see
awesome.
the two worlds kind of come together a little bit. That's one of the hopes for this
Sure.
podcast too, is kind of getting some disparate worlds within the sporting space to kind of just have conversations. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's really cool. Hey, can I do a quick lightning round with you, and then we'll wrap up with two
Absolutely.
questions? Okay.
Let's do it.
Are you a coffee or tea person?
Coffee.
Okay, I'm with you on that one. Would you rather work out in morning or night?
Morning.
Yeah, ditto. One time I had to work out at like 6:15, and I was like, "What's happening here?" Although, is there a limit to the morning? Because like 5 a.m. is different than 8 a.m.
That's not happening. Nope.
5
I
a.
like to wake up when my body wakes me up because my job is 1 to 8:30 usually. So
Okay.
I've got wiggle room in the morning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, cool. So I would also say I'm a morning workout person with the caveat. Same caveat there. All right. If you could learn one new skill or hobby, what would it be?
Oh, calligraphy.
Oh, that'd be cool. I
Yeah.
love that. I love that.
Yeah.
All right. What would be a workout that you would beat Alexis at?
Ooh, pound for pound, I think I could get her in bench press. I have a crazy bench press. I don't know why. I think I have really short arms.
Let's go.
But
Let's go.
if we're not going pound for pound, anything that requires like a crazy range of motion. She'll win against anybody at the gymnastics stuff, so I'm not going to go with gymnastics. Matt, help me here. What's something that requires like a good amount of flexibility, some good range of motion?
I mean, so obviously the overhead squat's my always go to on that, but I actually think I'd love to see you guys bench. If you think you could beat her in a bench press,
I don't think I could beat her for bench, but I think I could beat her pound for pound. Like if we matched it,
yeah. Oh, sure.
She's taller, bigger. I'm 4'11", by the way.
I love that idea. This is the final question. If you could pick the music every day at the gym, what would be playing?
This is disclaimer. This is not what I listen to on a daily basis for leisure. In the gym, punk rock.
Punk rock? Any artists in particular?
I like Sleeping with Sirens. I like this Michigan band called Boys of Fall. They just like sound really like high schoolers going through their first breakup, and they're just gonna like scream about it. Like that is my shtick right there.
I like it. That angst, but we're like way past that angst, but it's nice to kind of like tap into occasionally.
Right.
Yeah. It's like when Yellow Card. Sorry.
No, I was going to say it's like 30-year-olds tapping into their 16-year-old angst.
100%. We're allowed to do that. Yeah, we have a right to do that. Okay. So here's my two final questions as we get ready to kind of wrap up the episode. Sure. If someone new to adaptive fitness is listening to this podcast, or maybe they're listening to it and they know somebody who's adaptive and they want to get them involved, what's the best piece of advice you would give them? Or what's a piece of advice? Yeah,
I would research adaptive sports in your area, because the mindset that you are going to find with somebody who has adaptive experience or maybe has a disability themselves and who is successful as an athlete is going to be way more useful than potentially just asking your gym bro friends for some exercises. Also, with that, I don't think relying on maybe the exercises that you've done at physical therapy or the idea of lightweight, high rep, wrap yourself in bubble wrap and be really careful is going to push you to be the best athlete that you can be and get both the quality of life effects and like the elite performance effects that you're looking for if you don't burst out of that comfort level. Your body has more plasticity, more ability to bounce back and do amazing things for you than you think. So push out of that comfort zone, find somebody who's had to do that themselves and ask them for advice.
That's awesome. And then this may tie right into the final question, but if you could encourage a younger version of yourself, what would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them that disabled is not a bad word. You can identify as being a person with disability, and that doesn't exclude you from being an athlete. That doesn't exclude you from being able to identify as strong or consistent or dedicated or motivated or cool or elite or any of those things. You can be both. Disabled doesn't exclude you from other categories that are cool. It's just another part about you.
Yeah. Oh, I love that, Abby. Thanks so much for being on the podcast and for bringing that to us today. This was awesome.
Thanks so much for having me. That was super fun.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. What I loved about Abby's story is how it really came full circle. She started as an adaptive athlete with EDS and learning what it meant to be an adaptive athlete, but then she was able to integrate that into a career, helping other adaptive athletes reach the pinnacle of their sport. I think that's really, really cool. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a friend, especially someone who might be navigating their own journey in adaptive fitness. And if you're a coach or gym owner, consider how you can create more inclusive training spaces for adaptive athletes. You can follow Abby's work and the University of Michigan Adaptive Sports Program on Instagram to stay updated on her coaching and the athletes that she trains at the University of Michigan. And when you follow Abby, you're going to get to see some of the ways that she adapts workouts for elite athletes, including some, well, let's just call them non-conventional ways that she trains some of her athletes. And if you want to hear more conversations like that, subscribe to the podcast. You can find us wherever you get podcasts. We've got a ton of incredible guests coming up. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Matt Hotho, and I'll see you next time.